Hi everyone, it's Brian Waters here from the QTube. I want to share with you a couple of interviews that I did recently when I had the pleasure of visiting Leeds Conservatoire. Leeds Conservatoire is a very prestigious music conservatoire in the north of England, and we're delighted to have had a relationship with Leeds Conservatoire for well over a year now. As you know, two of their course leaders appear regularly on our channel giving feedback and giving masterclasses. And we have an arrangement with the Conservatoire whereby their students are able to access our resources for free as part of their package as being students at Leeds Conservatoire. And this is a package that we're able to make available to any educational institution around the world, schools, universities, conservatoires, colleges. So if that's of interest to you as a student or as a teacher, get in touch with us. But I thought it would be really interesting and useful for you to hear, not from me, but from somebody who's actually using our resources within an educational context to see how they use them, how the course works, and what the benefits are really of using the QTube's film library. So in this episode, we'll be hearing from Brian Morrell and Andy Barraclough, who are the course leaders at Leeds Conservatoire for the film music course. And then in a subsequent episode next week, we'll be hearing from two students to hear about how they've enjoyed studying at Leeds Conservatoire, how they've used our resources, and perhaps a little bit about what their ambitions and plans are for the future, having completed the course at Leeds Conservatoire.
My name is Brian Morrell. I work at Leeds Conservatoire. I'm the deputy head of the School of Music and Education, and I wrote the film music degrees that I teach on.
I'm Andy Barraclough. I am the academic manager for film music at Leeds Conservatoire.
The course was set up in 2016, which is nearly 10 years ago. And basically, I wrote the original degree. At that time, I don't think there was any other composition for film music undergraduate courses anywhere. So I think it was the first of its kind. And I think now there's probably 2 or 3 out there, but it's the only one that really does what I would call hardcore composition.
We specialise essentially in commercial film music composition, whereas a lot of other places, understandably so, lean towards a more avant-garde academic approach. We try to incorporate all of that as well, but more a commercial outlook, as essentially that's why most people get into this side of the industry, whether that be through the music or the films themselves. When we first started the course, it was surprising just how honest the students were, the prospective students I should say, in their sort of choices of why they came here, the kind of commerciality of film music. Because I'll be honest, I was a little bit worried it was going to be lots of films that I'd never heard of. So there's definitely a market for that.
Before 2016, me and Andy used to run a module in film music, and a lot of the early people that did well came from that module. So they were taught essentially by me and Andy. They ended up working for Hans Zimmer. They ended up working for, one of them works for John Powell in Hollywood, another one worked for Junkie XL, and a lot of them ended up in London and places like that. And not all of them ended up as film composers. Often when you do an undergraduate degree, it will change you and you'll end up coming out differently as, from when you went in. And a lot of them got interested in arranging and producing and orchestration and even kind of music management. Initially, when we ran it as a modular thing, we used to let students just choose their own films, and they would do YouTube rips. They would often get films, DVDs or Blu-rays, and they'd just strip all the audio and they'd just put the music back and they'd try to fashion some kind of narrative behind it. But it was a bit hit and miss and it was a bit amateur looking. Then when I wrote the degree and Andy kind of joined us, Andy then went to great lengths to basically source some more professional clips.
Quite a lot of the courses out there obviously recognise this challenge, and I think from their point of view have found it incredibly difficult to come across anything. And by extension, they've implemented sound design within their pathways to combat that. So the students actually generally have to create all the sound effects and dialogue themselves. And we found that that wouldn't really work for our vision of the degree, because that would dilute the music aspect of it. So we were very conscious of that when we first started making our way into this. And essentially we do have a private library collection of material, which consists of film and television examples. So we've been able to get a sort of workable version, but sometimes there are sound effects and ambience missing, which is usually covered up by the music. This is obviously very difficult to come across, and it doesn't work on every single title. So, you know, the options are extremely limiting.
Well, QTube fills a very, very important gap. When I first came across QTube, I couldn't believe at first that anybody was doing this kind of thing, because it's notoriously hard to source films without music. And what students would either do is they would do the stuff that Andy's preparing for them, or they would strike up relationships with student directors. So you either had really polished, you know, multi-million pound budgets, or you had these kind of like £5 budget kind of student films. When QTube came along, it kind of really filled that gap in the middle, and and not only that, it presented us with a load of films that were of a type that we didn't have. For example, animation. We had no animation at that point. When QTube came along, we got a load of those things. So it was a different type of film, different character of film. It was a different market, and it fits effortlessly into that gap between the really high-end polished stuff and the student market.
Yeah, QTube, the amount of animation they have, obviously it's very attractive to young composers. I think this is because animation films themselves demand much more music, and that could be, you know, on the assumption that because it's not live action, the animation is, you know, it's done in a crude way, essentially, where it highlights and caricatures certain aspects of a character, where maybe, you know, in commercial film, they have a close-up of an actor, everything's filled in, lots of expression on the face. The requirement of music from a modern point of view might not be as advantageous to a composer, whereas animation itself, you know, lends itself to having a lot more music. It can cope with a lot more ideas because there's not as much there, which is ironic when people talk about animation, because they talk about the colors and the vibrancy of it and the attractiveness to it. And I think that's what composers get out of it. So that's why I think QTube was incredibly attractive to young composers. And we've seen a lot of those being rescored on the course itself.
And also they are challenging as well. Like Andy said, the animation is particularly challenging for composers, trying to kind of mock up the kind of Disney approach sometimes, and the Mickey Mousing effects and all the rest of it. And also you do a lot of documentaries where you have almost constant dialogue and narration. That is challenging as well. But it's real world. If they were doing real documentaries in the real world, they'd be having to grapple with having to put music behind people talking incessantly. So what we find is that QTube fills a gap, but it also fills that gap as well. It gives us different types of films. We do a thing called Film Night, which has been running again for like 10, in fact more, 15 years. And it's just a thing that I set up years ago where we get guest directors or guest composers up. It's normally 5 or 6 times a year. We go into one of the big theatres, and the students will play their music and then get quality feedback from a panel of industry professionals. And before QTube came along, it was mainly either the films that Andy was doing for them, or it was director films, whereas now we get quite a lot of QTube in there.
They're able to incorporate the QTube library into any of their assessments. They're required to write music in almost every single assessment in the program. But what's great about our third year version is the portfolio is much bigger, and therefore what's so attractive about QTube that Brian's already alluded to is the fact that they are full films in and of themselves, and we are incredibly restricted with the fair usage policy. So what's limiting about the fair usage policy is we give them 4 minutes, but that 4 minutes has been curated by ourselves. Therefore, the sync points are kind of obvious to the student. And what the advantage of doing QTube films, full films, is that they have to discover them themselves. And one of our colleagues, Stephen Gordon, on the course, always says that the students are almost filmmakers in that respect. And what's interesting about what I've seen from QTube recently with handing out cue sheets, it's just making that collaboration between creatives a little bit more realistic. Whereas at the minute, the students all get those options and it's not quite what would happen out there. So that's, again, another advantage of doing the QTube clips.
When I first set it up, to me, it seemed a natural thing to do to get a director on board. Because you think about it, film composers, if they spend their entire life in academia with other composers, that's great. We can teach them how to write music. But what we can't teach them is how to deal with the director. So I brought Stefan on board, and it is a bit unique. Lots of visitors we've had have talked about the fact that they don't know any other place where they have a music course with a director on board, doing that side of it, doing essentially film studies, aesthetics, what the meaning of film is. And it is an acquired taste. Sometimes the students do find it challenging to wrap their head around that side of it, but it is really, really crucial. It's really crucial. It's only when they understand Stefan's world, if I can put it that way, that they can become good composers. I think regarding the relationship with QTube, quite apart from the films they've got, the relationship is good because as soon as they come on board, they get given a serial number and they can access everything. So, and that's been really beneficial.
Because of the diversity in material that QTube has, we're confident in being able to recommend it to our students and say, if you build something, a little bit of everything. So because the reason I say that is a lot of students tend to want to stick to their comfort zones. And if you were to make your way through QTube, that's not actually possible. And there's so much variance and it's quite, very challenging for a composer, but that's what a traditional film composer would be, a chameleon. So what we find is people using QTube will likely be more challenged in that respect.
You can't just hide behind the film. You can't do what you might do on another film, which just put a load of pad sounds and hope for the best. With something like the animation especially, that's got to be structured. There's got to be a sense of architecture which is almost separate to the music, and it's very hard to do, but when it comes off, it's very rewarding.
So thanks to Brian and Andy for their time and for their insight. Really useful and interesting, and as I say, we're absolutely delighted to have that relationship with Leeds Conservatoire. And in next week's episode, we'll be hearing from 2 students who've recently completed the course at Leeds Conservatoire to get their insight into the course and into how they've used our resources and a little bit of a glimpse into what they think they might be doing next.
The thing I really like about it is the fact that as a cohort, we're able to kind of compare our approaches and how we've decided to kind of interpret clips and hit points and things like that. It was taking the narration and seeing how can that lead my musical choices.
So thanks a lot. Give us a like and subscribe, of course, and tune in for the next episode. Thanks a lot and bye for now.